What if I told you that the worst pain I ever experienced didn't come from illness or poverty, but from the hands of the man who was supposed to protect me? And what if I told you that my own mother watched and did nothing? My name is Margaret Elaine Porter. I'm 82 years old, and I was born and raised in Gainesville, Georgia, in a wooden house at the edge of a dusty road where the trees whispered secrets and the air was heavy with silence. I've been called many things in life: daughter, mother, widow, survivor. But today, I want to tell you about the part of me that few know, the little girl I used to be, the one I buried for decades under recipes, chores, and fake smiles, the one I finally dug up when I turned 70, because that little girl never stopped screaming. I was born in 1943, the second child of Ruth and Porter and William Clyde Porter, a man feared by all in the neighborhood, a deacon at the local Baptist church, respected, stern, a man of God, people said. They didn't know what I knew, what I lived. They didn't hear the creaking floorboards in the middle of the night. They didn't hear the door open slowly, the hush in his breath. They didn't feel the chill of his shadow standing by the bed. They didn't smell the alcohol on his breath or see the flicker of something evil in his eyes. But I did. The first time it happened, I was 8. I was wearing a blue nightgown with tiny white flowers. My mother had sewn it herself. I was proud of it. I felt safe in it. He came into my room that night, sat at the edge of my bed, and told me I was a special little girl, that I shouldn't scream, that God would be angry if I did. I froze. My little body didn't understand, but my soul did. I don't remember every second of what he did, but I remember the pain. I remember the shame. I remember curling up in the corner of the bed after he left, biting the edge of my pillow so my sobs wouldn't wake my siblings. The next morning, I told my mother. She was washing clothes on the back porch, her apron stained with soap and flour. I stood there, trembling, my voice a whisper. "Mama, Daddy did something bad last night." She didn't even look at me. "You must have dreamed it," she said. "Go help your sister with the biscuits." That was the beginning. He came back, again and again, sometimes twice a week, sometimes more. And she knew. I saw it in her eyes. I heard it in the way she slammed the pots in the kitchen when he went into my room. I felt it in the way she pulled me harder when she brushed my hair. But she never stopped him. Not once. I started to disappear inside myself. I spoke less, laughed less. I stopped playing hopscotch with the other girls. I stayed indoors, helping Mama with chores, keeping quiet. I became a ghost in my own home. By the time I turned 10, I knew exactly when he would come. I knew the sound of his boots. I knew the smell of the cigarette he lit after he was done. I knew the words he used. "If you tell anyone, you'll burn in hell. God punishes liars." So I stayed quiet. I stayed silent for decades. I don't tell you this to shock you. I tell you because someone out there needs to know they are not alone. That silence is not safety. That fear is not faith. This story isn't just mine. It belongs to every girl who was betrayed by the ones who were supposed to love her. Every woman who grew up thinking she was dirty, broken, unworthy of joy. But I am here, at 82, breathing, speaking, healing, not because it was easy, but because I refused to let the past own me forever. In this series, I'll tell you everything. The nights I spent staring at the ceiling, praying to die. The day I ran away. The love I thought I found. The child I brought into the world, and how I feared she'd suffer like me. I'll tell you how I rebuilt myself, brick by brick, scar by scar. And I ask only one thing of you. If my story touches something deep inside you, leave a comment saying, "I'm ready to heal." Then like this video and subscribe to this channel because maybe, just maybe, this isn't just my story. Maybe it's ours. The second time he came into my room, I didn't cry. I didn't fight. I didn't speak. I didn't breathe. I just laid there, still as the night, while his hands violated every corner of my body and soul. I stared at the ceiling and counted the cracks in the old plaster just to survive. It became a ritual, my way of leaving my body. He whispered things I still can't forget. You're my gift from God. Don't ruin this. You're the only one who understands me. And afterwards, as he buttoned up his shirt, he always said the same thing. Don't you dare say a word. Your mother would hate you. And I believed him because my mother, Ruth, and never once came to check on me. Never once asked me why I stopped singing, why I flinched every time someone touched me, why I never looked people in the eye anymore. I began wetting the bed again. My mother slapped me for it, hard, with the back of her hand. She said I was too old for that kind of mess, that I was just trying to get attention. Attention was the last thing I wanted. The church kept praising my father. Brother William is a man of principle. He's strict but God-fearing. They made him Sunday school coordinator. He started teaching little boys how to be strong men of God. I was 10, and I wanted to scream every time they shook his hand. There was one woman in church, Mrs. Virginia Bloom, who seemed to notice something. She always gave me a soft smile. Once, she even pulled me aside and asked, "Are you okay, sweetheart? You always look so far away." I wanted to tell her. My heart pounded in my chest. My lips trembled. But before I could say a word, my mother appeared behind me and answered for me. She's just shy. Always been like that. And that was the end of that. Afterwards, I was punished for drawing attention. My father told me that if I ever made people suspicious again, he'd send me to the asylum outside town. I'd heard stories about that place, how they shaved your head, how they locked you in rooms with screaming women. I was terrified, so I stayed silent. My sister, Ellen, was older than me by 3 years. She was everything I wasn't: bold, outspoken, confident. She wore red lipstick at 15 and rolled her eyes when Daddy preached at the dinner table. I often wondered why he never touched her. I found out one day when I asked, because she'd tell, he said, tightening his belt around his waist. You're a good girl. You know how to keep a secret. And I did, for years. When I turned 12, he started asking me to sit on his lap in front of other people. He'd smile and stroke my hair while others watched. No one ever said anything. No one dared challenge him, not even the pastor. I remember one Sunday morning, after a long night where he had come into my room reeking of whiskey, he stood at the pulpit and read from Proverbs. He that spareth his rod hateth his son, but he that loveth him chasteneth him betimes. Everyone nodded in agreement. Amen, they shouted. I looked around and realized that no one, not a soul in that church, would believe me, not against him. I started hiding my nightgowns. I wore jeans to bed. I tried placing furniture in front of the door, but nothing worked. He always found a way in. There were nights I prayed until my lips cracked. I begged God to make me disappear. I bargained. Take my life. Just don't let him come tonight. But God was silent. Or maybe he just wasn't listening. One night, I tried to run away. I packed a brown paper bag with a piece of bread, a tin of peanut butter, and a small photograph of my grandmother. I slipped out the back door barefoot. But before I made it past the edge of the yard, he caught me. He dragged me back by the arm and threw me into the living room. My mother stood there, arms crossed, saying nothing. He beat me with a switch from the willow tree, then locked me in the pantry for a day and a half with nothing but a jar of water. That was when I broke. Inside. After that, I stopped fighting. I stopped hoping. I became two people. one that everyone saw, quiet, obedient, helpful, and one that lived deep inside, screaming silently, clawing at the walls of my mind, begging to be saved. At 13, I started bleeding. My first period. My mother slapped me again. You better not be doing anything to bring shame on this house. I wanted to laugh, to scream, to tell her that the shame was his, that she was the one who let it happen. But I didn't, because by then I already knew the rules. My voice wasn't welcome. My pain wasn't real. That year, I began to hurt myself. Not enough to die, just enough to feel something I could control. I scratched my skin raw. I punched my own stomach. I stopped eating for days. And no one noticed. Not the school teacher who praised my handwriting. Not the neighbor who borrowed sugar every week. Not even Ellen, who had started dating and barely came home anymore. I remember looking in the mirror one day and not recognizing the girl staring back. She had dark circles under her eyes, hollow cheeks, lifeless lips. She looked like a ghost. I tried to smile. It looked fake, plastic. That's when I stopped looking in mirrors altogether. By 14, I had mastered the art of hiding. Hiding bruises, hiding tears, hiding who I really was. But no matter how good I got at pretending, the pain stayed. It stayed in the way I flinched when someone raised their voice. It stayed in the way I slept curled into a ball, even on warm nights. It stayed in the way I refused to hug people, afraid their hands might hurt. I grew up in silence. But one day, something changed. And that's the story I'll tell you next. There's a pain worse than abuse. It's the pain of knowing someone new and did nothing. My mother, Ruth, and wasn't blind. She wasn't deaf. She wasn't naive. She was complicit. She folded laundry while I sobbed in silence. She baked cornbread while I bled into my sheets. She sewed dresses while I shrank inside myself day after day. And she never once asked why. I tried to understand her. I told myself she must have been scared, that maybe she, too, was once a victim. But the truth is, she chose him over me. Again and again. One day, I asked her, "Mama, why didn't you stop him?" She turned to me with that cold stare she always wore when she was angry. "I don't know what you think you saw or imagined," she said, "but your father is a man of God. You will not tarnish his name in this house." I was 16. I had a mouthful of words I had swallowed for years, but none of them came out. I nodded. I went back to peeling potatoes. My hands trembled. That was the day I realized she wasn't going to save me. Not now. Not ever. Church became unbearable. My father, William Clyde, kept rising in status. They made him head of the men's ministry. He began counseling couples, preaching purity and discipline. I sat there in the wooden pew, sweating, feeling like I was dying inside. Once, during a sermon about forgiveness, he looked right at me. He said, "A daughter must honor her father, for he is her earthly guide, as God commands." People nodded. Some even clapped. I felt like vomiting. I stopped praying. What was the point? I had prayed so hard, so long, so desperately, and nothing changed. I started to believe maybe God was like my mother, watching but unmoved. Maybe he didn't care. Maybe he agreed with my father. Maybe I was the problem. I began to hate Sundays. I hated the hymns. I hated the verses. I hated the cross above the pulpit, because to me, it was no longer a symbol of love. It was a cage. At school, I learned how to fake normal. I smiled at the right moments. I did my homework. I joined the choir. I even made a friend, Laura King, a sweet girl who loved poetry and wore her hair in braids. She invited me over once. Her mother made lemonade. Her father kissed her forehead before leaving for work. I watched them like I was watching a movie. I didn't know families like that existed. Laura once asked why I never invited her over. I told her we were very private. She believed me. Everyone did. By the time I was 17, I had perfected the art of invisibility. But one afternoon, after school, something broke inside me. My father had come into my room the night before, more violent than usual. My body still ached. My wrists were bruised. I sat in the back of class, unable to concentrate. The teacher, Mr. Harris, asked me a question. I didn't hear him. He walked over, touched my shoulder. I screamed. The entire class stared. I ran out of the room, locking myself in the girls' bathroom. That day, I came the closest I'd ever been to telling someone. But I didn't. I walked home slowly, my legs heavy, my chest hollow. I opened the door, and my mother was there, waiting with a wooden spoon. "Your school called," she said. "You embarrassed this family. What's gotten into you?" I wanted to shout, "He's what's in me." But instead, I lowered my head and said, "Sorry." And then she hit me, not once, not twice, over and over, like she was trying to beat the truth out of me. Afterwards, I sat in my room, holding my stomach, looking at the small mirror on my dresser. And I whispered, "God, do you see me at all?" I didn't hear an answer, just silence. The same silence I'd lived in my whole life. That night, I decided I would leave. Not just the house, not just the town, but everything. I wanted to disappear, to never be Margaret again, to erase every trace of that house, that church, that name. And yet, I stayed. Why? Because fear is stronger than logic. Because trauma teaches you to survive, not to escape. Because even when you know you're dying inside, leaving feels like jumping into the unknown without a parachute. Still, something inside me was changing. I began writing letters to myself. I called myself by different names. I pretended I was someone else. In those letters, I wrote the truth. I described every night, every scar, every scream. It was my way of fighting back. Quietly, in secret. And one day, I wrote something that stopped me cold. "I am not dirty. He is." I stared at that sentence for hours. I didn't believe it yet, but I wanted to. So I wrote it again and again, until my hand cramped, until the paper tore, until I believed it just a little. I began to fantasize about a different life, one where I lived in a house with blue curtains and a garden, one where I had a daughter who laughed freely, one where no man ever touched me without love. And I held on to that vision like a lifeline, because deep down, I knew if I didn't hold on to something, I wouldn't survive much longer. And then, like a spark in the darkness, something happened that would change the course of everything. And that's what I'll tell you in the next part. I was 17, the first time I truly wanted to die. It wasn't just a passing thought. It was a plan, a quiet, methodical decision carved in silence over years of pain. That night, my father had come home from a church meeting drunk. He never drank in public, only behind closed doors. He reeked of whiskey and sweat. His shirt was unbuttoned halfway, and his Bible lay crooked on the table like a forgotten prop in a play he no longer cared to perform. He said nothing when he came in, just walked straight to the kitchen, where my mother was stirring a pot of beans. He slapped her, hard. I heard the sound from my bedroom. Then silence. A few moments later, I heard his footsteps. Heavy, slow, familiar. I felt the air shift in the hallway. I knew exactly what was coming. I closed my eyes. I prayed for the ground to open and swallow me whole, but it didn't. The door creaked open. I smelled the whiskey first, then the rage. "Get up," he said. I didn't move. Get up. I tried. My legs shook. My voice refused to come out. My body was sore from the last time. That night, he was more violent than ever. He cursed God. He laughed while hurting me. He called me names I still can't repeat. When he finished, he spat on the floor and walked out like nothing had happened. I curled into the far corner of the bed, clutching my pillow, unable to cry. Not because I didn't want to, but because there was nothing left inside me. That was the night I decided to leave this world. The idea didn't come from desperation. It came from exhaustion. I just didn't want to feel anymore. I waited until dawn. My mother had gone to the market. My father was passed out in the chair. I went into the bathroom. I locked the door. I took the box of sleeping pills my mother kept for her migraines and poured them into my hand. I stared at them. They looked small, harmless, but in that moment, they felt like freedom. I placed them on my tongue. I reached for the glass of water. And then I stopped. I don't know why. I really don't. Maybe it was the sound of birds chirping outside the window. Maybe it was the memory of my grandmother's voice telling me stories about heaven. Maybe it was something divine. Or maybe just a flicker of life that refused to go out. But I stopped. I sat there for hours, staring, shaking, holding those pills like they were both poison and salvation. Eventually, I flushed them down the toilet. I didn't tell anyone. I went back to pretending. But something changed that day. I realized I didn't want to die. I wanted to be someone else. Somewhere else. Free. That summer, I started planning my escape, not just emotionally, but physically. I took a job cleaning at Mrs. Edith Green's diner down the road. She paid in cash. No questions asked. I told my parents I was helping a friend. Every dollar I made, I hid in a sock behind a loose panel in the closet. It was the only thing that gave me hope. At the diner, I met Tommy Baldwin, a 22-year-old who worked nights delivering groceries. He was kind, soft-spoken. His hands never reached for me. He just talked, asked questions, laughed at my jokes. It terrified me. I wasn't used to kindness from men. It felt like a trick. But he was patient. One evening, he offered to drive me home. I refused. He didn't insist. Instead, he handed me a small paper flower he had made from a napkin. "It won't die," he said, smiling, like real flowers do. I took it. I kept it. For years. Tommy became a sliver of light in my dark world. Not because I loved him, but because he saw me. Really saw me. He once asked about the bruises on my arm. I lied. I said I tripped, but he looked me in the eye and said, "You don't have to lie to me, Maggie." I burst into tears. It was the first time I cried in front of someone since I was 8. That night, I wrote in my secret notebook, "Maybe I am worth saving." That sentence changed everything. I began to believe I could leave, that I could make it on my own, that there was a world beyond that house, that pain, that silence. I didn't tell Tommy everything. Not yet. But I told him enough. And for the first time, someone believed me. He didn't flinch. He didn't pity me. He just listened. And that was the beginning of my freedom. But leaving wouldn't be easy. My father was still there, watching, controlling, violent. I knew I had to be careful. One wrong move, and he'd lock me away. Or worse. So I waited. I planned. And then one day, the moment came. And I'll tell you all about it in the next part. I don't know how to explain the feeling of walking away from the house where you were murdered every night, but your heart still beats. It was like walking out of a grave with my own hands shaking the dirt off my skin. I was almost 18. I had been planning for months. I knew my father's routines. I knew when he went to church, when he took naps, when he drank himself to sleep. I knew where he kept the car keys. I even knew how to avoid the squeaky stair outside the back door. The night I left, I didn't pack a suitcase. Just a plastic bag with 2 changes of clothes, my secret notebook, the napkin flour Tommy gave me, and $33 in crumpled bills. I told my mother I was going to help with a church event. She didn't look up from the dishes. She just nodded. As I walked to the edge of our yard, I turned around once, just once. I looked at that small white house with peeling paint and a porch that creaked like an old man's back. The house where my childhood died. The house where my soul was buried beneath prayers that meant nothing and sermons that masked sins. And I swore I would never come back. Tommy was waiting with the truck. I had written him a note the day before and slipped it under his windshield. All it said was, "Tonight, please." When I climbed into the passenger seat, I didn't say anything. Neither did he. We drove in silence for an hour until we reached a small town across the state line. He took me to his cousin's place, Carol Baldwin, a single mother of 2 who worked night shifts at a factory. Carol didn't ask too many questions. She gave me the couch, told me I could stay as long as I needed. I cried that night, not because I was scared, but because it was the first time I had ever felt the freedom to cry. The next morning, Tommy brought me coffee and a donut. He sat on the floor across from me. "You're safe now?" he said. But I wasn't. Not really. Because freedom isn't just about leaving. It's about healing. And that part hadn't even begun. I had nightmares every night. I'd wake up screaming. Carol's kids would stare at me from the hallway, wide-eyed. I apologized constantly for the noise, for taking space, for existing. I couldn't look at myself in the mirror. I couldn't touch my own arms without flinching. I couldn't breathe deeply without feeling like I was choking. One day, Carol handed me a pamphlet. It was from a women's shelter in the city. "They have therapy, real therapy," she said. "I think it might help." I went. I sat in a circle of women who had stories like mine. Some worse, some eerily similar. I met a woman named Vanessa who had run from her husband and left behind 3 children just to survive. She looked me in the eyes and said, "You are not what happened to you." I didn't believe her, but I wanted to. Therapy was hard. Talking about it felt like peeling my skin off, layer by layer. I vomited after my first session. I shook for hours, but I went back, again and again, because somewhere deep inside, I knew silence had nearly killed me. I wasn't going to let it finish the job. I started working at a laundromat. I saved every penny. I slept on Carol's couch for 6 months. Tommy and I stayed friends. He never pushed, never crossed boundaries. When I told him I needed space, he gave it. I began to feel like I had control over something, even if it was just which socks to fold first. One afternoon, while folding clothes, I saw a little girl walk in with her mother. The girl looked about 8. She smiled at me and said, "Hi." And I froze. She looked just like me, or maybe like the girl I used to be, before everything. I turned away. My hands trembled. I didn't realize how deep the scars ran until that moment. I left work early that day. I sat on a park bench and cried for an hour. That night, I wrote in my notebook, "I want to be someone who protects little girls like her. I want to become the mother I never had." It was the first time I admitted I wanted to be a mother. Not yet, not then, but someday. A year passed. Then, too, I moved out of Carol's house, got my own studio apartment, painted the walls yellow, bought curtains with sunflowers. I grew basil on the windowsill, and I started smiling again. Not because everything was okay, but because I had survived. And survival, as I would come to learn, is the seed of rebirth. I was 22 when I found out I was pregnant. The first thing I felt wasn't joy. It wasn't excitement. It was terror. I stared at the pregnancy test in the cramped bathroom of my apartment, the little blue lines confirming something I already knew deep in my body. My hands trembled. My knees felt like water. And in my head, I heard his voice, my father's voice, telling me I was unworthy, filthy, ruined. I sat on the floor for a long time, just breathing, just trying to not disappear again. The baby was Tommy's. We had been together for about a year. He had become my safe place, my quiet anchor in the chaos. He never pressured me. He never demanded more than I could give. He held my hand when I had nightmares. He read my journal when I was too afraid to speak. He saw every scar and never flinched. But I hadn't told him I stopped taking birth control. I don't even know why I did. Maybe part of me longed for a new beginning. Maybe part of me wanted to prove that I could carry life instead of death. When I told him, his face went still. He didn't yell. He didn't leave. He just sat with me on the couch and said, "Whatever you choose, I'm here." I chose life, not because I was ready, but because I wanted to break the cycle. I wanted to give this baby what I never had, a mother who would die before letting harm come through the door. Pregnancy was hard. Every kick reminded me of the life growing inside me, and the life I was still learning to protect. I went to therapy twice a week. I read every book I could find. I wrote letters to my unborn child. I don't know if I'll be a good mother, but I promise to never be silent. I promise to listen when you cry. I promise to believe you, even when the truth is hard. I decided early on that I wouldn't know the baby's gender until birth. I didn't want to project anything onto them. I just wanted to meet them as they were. In my 6th month, I had a panic attack during a sonogram. The doctor had a beard. His hands reminded me of someone else's. I froze. I couldn't breathe. I began shaking uncontrollably. They called in a nurse named Amber who sat with me, held my hand, and whispered, "You're safe. This is now. He's not here." That phrase became my mantra. This is now. He's not here. When labor came, it was long and brutal. 31 hours of pain, sweat, and fear. But when they placed that tiny bundle on my chest, everything blurred. She was perfect. A girl, with a tiny cry like a bird, with eyes that opened wide, searching the world, with fists clenched like she already knew how to fight. I named her Eleanor Grace, and in that moment, I became someone new. I became a mother. The first few weeks were a blur of diapers, midnight feedings, and tears, hers and mine. There were moments I didn't think I could do it, when she cried for hours and nothing worked, when I held her and felt the weight of all my fears pressing down on my chest. But then she smiled. At 4 weeks, just a flicker, and something inside me healed. Being a mother wasn't just about raising a child. It was about raising myself alongside her, teaching both of us that love didn't have to hurt, that family didn't have to mean fear. One night, while rocking her to sleep, I whispered, "I will never let anyone touch you the way I was touched. I will never let silence steal your voice." And I meant it, but the world isn't kind to women like me. One day, I took Eleanor to church. It was a small congregation led by a young pastor named Reverend Daniels, who preached about grace and justice. I sat in the back with Eleanor asleep in my arms. During the sermon, he said, "Some of you think God abandoned you, but what if he was weeping with you the whole time?" I broke, right there, in the pew, with my baby in my arms. I cried like I hadn't in years, and I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel since I was a child. Hope. Maybe God hadn't left. Maybe he was there all along, waiting for me to find my way back. But faith, like healing, is not linear. There were still days I flinched at footsteps. Nights I locked every door twice. Moments when Eleanor touched my face, and I had to breathe through the memories. But I kept going. For her. For me. For the girl I used to be, the one who survived so that we could live. And just when I thought life might finally settle, my past knocked on my door. It had been almost 6 years since I left that house, since I'd heard his voice. I had built something fragile but real. I had a job managing a small bookstore, a modest apartment with toys scattered across the floor, and a daughter who laughed with her whole body. Eleanor was 5, and she loved dinosaurs. She wore little glasses with purple frames and corrected anyone who called a triceratops a dinosaur instead of a ceratopsian. She made me laugh every single day. She made me believe that maybe, just maybe, I had done something right. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Wednesday, a plain white envelope with my name written in shaky cursive. No return address, no stamps. Hand-delivered. I opened it in the kitchen while Eleanor painted the floor with orange finger paint. There were only 2 sentences. I know where you are. We're not done. No name. But I didn't need one. My body knew before my mind did. The way my stomach twisted, the cold sweat, the roar in my ears. It was him. My father had found me. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping. Eleanor came over, her tiny fingers touching my arm, her voice asking if I was okay. I lied. Mommy's just tired. Baby, that night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with every light on, clutching a baseball bat, staring at the front door. The next day, I filed a restraining order. But the court told me they couldn't issue one without proof of recent contact or threat. I showed them the note. They said it wasn't enough. Not enough. What was enough? Blood. I moved apartments the next week. I pulled Eleanor out of preschool. I started carrying pepper spray everywhere. I changed my number. I told Tommy what happened. He wanted to come back, to help, but I told him no. This was my fight. At night, I began hearing things. Doors creaking. Footsteps. A shadow outside the window. I didn't know what was real anymore. I started therapy again. My old therapist, Dr. Laurel, welcomed me back without judgment. She said, trauma doesn't die quietly. It waits. It watches. And sometimes it knocks. I asked her if I was broken. She said, no, you're vigilant. And that kept you alive. I kept Eleanor close. I told her nothing, just that we were playing a quiet game for a while. She thought it was fun. But inside me, I was unraveling. Then, one morning as I walked Eleanor to the park, I saw a man across the street. Tall, wearing a hat, watching. I froze. He turned and walked away before I could even process it. Was it him? Was it paranoia? I called the police again. They came, took a report, promised to patrol more often, but there was nothing they could do. I started writing letters again, not to anyone, just to myself. Dear Margaret, you are not a little girl anymore. You are a mother, a fighter. He can't take that from you. Each letter became an anchor. I taught Eleanor how to scream, how to run, how to dial 911. She thought it was a game. I cried in the shower where she couldn't hear me. Then, one evening, there was a knock at the door. I nearly dropped the pan I was holding. I crept toward it, looked through the peephole. It wasn't him. It was Carol. She looked older, grayer, but her eyes were the same. I had a feeling, she said, stepping inside. Something told me you needed someone. I broke down. She stayed the night. And for the first time in weeks, I slept. Carol offered to stay for a while. Help with Eleanor. Give me time to breathe. I said yes. She cooked, cleaned, read bedtime stories. One night, she said, "You need to write it down, Margaret. All of it. Not for a book. For you. To take the power back." So I did. Late at night, after Eleanor fell asleep, I wrote. Every detail. Every memory. Every scream. I wrote until my fingers ached. And somewhere between the lines, I started to feel lighter. Because telling the truth, my truth, was an act of rebellion. It was a way of saying, "You don't own me anymore." And I began to believe it. But healing isn't a straight path. Sometimes it circles back. And one day, it circled harder than ever. It was a quiet Sunday morning, the kind of peaceful lull that feels like a breath between storms. Eleanor was in the living room coloring a picture of a stegosaurus wearing a crown, giggling to herself. Carol was in the kitchen, humming an old gospel tune while stirring a pot of oatmeal. I stood at the sink, rinsing a plate, letting the warm water run over my hands longer than necessary. For a moment, I felt normal. I didn't hear the knock this time. I heard the crash. Glass shattering. Carol screamed. I ran to the living room just in time to see a flaming bottle arc through the broken window and hit the far wall. It exploded on impact. Flames leapt up the curtains like they had been waiting years to dance. "Eleanor!" I screamed, lunging forward and scooping her up in my arms. She was crying, terrified, gripping her stegosaurus drawing in one hand. I turned to see Carol trying to beat the flames with a blanket. "Out! Get out!" I yelled. We ran. I kicked open the front door, barefoot, adrenaline replacing fear. We stumbled onto the lawn, coughing, eyes stinging from smoke. Neighbors began pouring out of their homes, some with phones, others with water hoses. The fire spread fast, too fast. By the time the fire trucks arrived, half the living room was gone. And so was the man who threw that bottle. I knew it was him, even though I hadn't seen his face, even though I had no proof. The police came, took statements, asked questions I couldn't answer. "Do you have enemies? Has anyone threatened you recently? Do you recognize this bottle?" No, no, no. But I knew. He was here. He was angry. He was punishing me for surviving. They called it arson. They never found him. We stayed in a shelter that night. Eleanor clung to me like a second skin. She didn't ask for her toys. She didn't ask about her room. She just whispered, "I'm scared, Mommy," over and over until she fell asleep in my lap. Carol sat beside me in silence. The shelter was loud. Babies crying, women whispering, doors creaking open and shut all night. I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, counting every breath. In the morning, a social worker gave us vouchers, clothes, toothbrushes, directions to a transitional housing unit. I felt like I had gone back to zero. Everything I had built burned. The books, the photos, the yellow curtains, the little basil plant Eleanor watered every day, gone. But we were alive, and that had to mean something. The next weeks were a blur. Paperwork, phone calls, therapy sessions. Carol moved in with her sister. Eleanor and I moved into a single-room unit with peeling paint and a broken lock on the bathroom door. But there was a window, and through that window I could see a tree, and in that tree was a bird's nest, and in that nest 3 tiny eggs. Every morning I sat with Eleanor by the window and watched that nest. "Do you think they'll hatch?" she asked. "I do," I said. "They just need time." And so did we. I bought her new crayons, a new Stegosaurus book. I drew her a picture of the sun and taped it above her bed. She started sleeping through the night again. I kept writing. I wrote about the fire, about the man, about the silence that followed. And in my writing, I found something unexpected. Anger, not just fear, not just grief, rage, at my father, at my mother for staying silent, at the church that protected him, at the system that said a note wasn't enough. And that rage fueled me. I contacted a lawyer. I asked if I could sue him. He said yes, if I could find him, if I had evidence. I didn't, but I filed a report anyway, a statement, a record, something to say. I am not invisible. I began speaking at support groups. Women like me, stories like mine. We cried together. We laughed. We screamed. And I watched them heal. And in watching them, I healed too, bit by bit, scar by scar. And then, one night, Eleanor woke me up. "Mommy," she whispered, "someone's outside." I froze. I grabbed the bat from under my bed and crept to the window. There was a shadow, tall, still, watching. My breath caught. But then the shadow stepped into the light. It wasn't him. It was Tommy. He held a suitcase in one hand and a stuffed stegosaurus in the other. And in his eyes, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Love, unwavering. I opened the door slowly, heart pounding, hands trembling, unsure if this was real or just another ghost from my past. But it was Tommy, older, thinner, eyes heavier, but the same softness underneath. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there in the dim hallway light, holding the toy dinosaur like it was sacred. I heard what happened. He said, "Finally, I should have come sooner. I'm sorry." I wanted to fall into his arms. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw things, collapse, rage against the timing of the universe. Instead, I said, "You're here now." He stayed. He slept on the floor that night, refusing the bed. Eleanor curled up beside me, one hand on my chest, the other still gripping her new dinosaur. I didn't sleep, but I wasn't afraid. For the first time in years, there was a man in the house, and I didn't feel like I had to sleep with one eye open. The next morning, we had oatmeal and silence. Carol called, crying with relief. Eleanor asked if Tommy was going to stay forever. He looked at me. I looked at him, and I said, "We'll see." Over the weeks that followed, Tommy didn't push. He cooked. He picked up Eleanor from daycare. He painted her a mural of a dinosaur forest on the one clean wall we had. He rebuilt our routines without ever demanding a space in them. And I began to soften. I began to breathe without flinching. One night, as I folded laundry, he sat beside me and said, "You've changed." I looked at him, unsure what he meant. "You're stronger," he added, "and you don't apologize for breathing anymore." That hit me hard, because it was true. There had been a time I said sorry for everything if I took up space, if I cried too loud, if I dared to exist. But now I walked with my head a little higher. I spoke without shrinking. I demanded locks that worked, doors that closed, safety that wasn't conditional. And I stopped apologizing for it. I started seeing a new therapist, Dr. Patel, a woman who survived abuse herself. She didn't waste time with cliches. She got right to the heart of things. She asked me, "What would you say to your younger self?" And I answered without thinking, "I'm sorry it took so long to protect you." I wept for hours because for so long I had hated that girl, blamed her, shamed her. But now I wanted to hold her. I wanted to tell her it was never her fault, that her silence was survival, that her tears were holy, that her voice mattered even when no one listened. I started writing publicly, blogs, essays, anonymous posts at first, then under my name, Margaret Elaine Porter. I wrote about trauma, about motherhood, about reclaiming your name when the world tries to erase you. And women wrote back. Hundreds. Thousands. I thought I was alone. I never told anyone. You gave me the courage to speak. And I realized my voice was powerful, not because it was loud, but because it was true. Tommy and I became a family again. Not perfect, but honest. He never tried to fix me. He just held space for me to grow. And Eleanor, she flourished. She told her kindergarten teacher she wanted to be a paleontologist superhero. She corrected strangers when they said dinosaurs weren't real. She called me her bravest mommy, and sometimes when I tucked her in, she whispered, "I'm safe with you." I tattooed those words on my arm. I got another tattoo, two just above my heart, a stegosaurus, because that was the symbol of everything I had survived, everything I had built, everything I had reclaimed. Then came the news. My father had died. I got a call from a lawyer in Georgia. No one claimed the body. No one wanted the estate. There wasn't much left. But there was a letter, addressed to me. I stared at it for hours. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want his words anywhere near my healing. But something inside me said, "Read it, then let it go." It was short. No apology. No confession. Just 4 words. "You ruined my life." I laughed. I really did. I laughed so hard I cried, because for once the power wasn't his. It never had been. I burned the letter, watched it turn to ash on the balcony, the wind carrying his words far away from me. And in that moment, I felt it. Not relief, not justice, but peace. And that peace was mine. Not given, not stolen, not conditional. Mine. Forever. It's been 11 years since the night of the fire. 10 since Tommy returned. 8 since Eleanor asked me if monsters were real. And now, I sit on my porch in Kentucky, sipping lukewarm tea, watching the wind stir the tall grass beyond the yard. Eleanor plays in the distance with a magnifying glass and a fossil kit. Tommy is inside, arguing with a customer over the phone in his little home office. And me, I'm at peace. Real peace. The kind you build. The kind no one gives you. You carve it with your own 2 hands. I used to think healing would be a sunrise. Sudden. Golden. Radiant. But it wasn't. It was more like gardening. Slow. Painstaking. Sometimes things grew. Sometimes they died. Sometimes the weeds came back, and I had to get on my knees and dig them out all over again. But I learned to keep planting. Anyway, I've spoken at over 70 women's shelters, told my story in schools, in churches, on stages, sometimes with tears, sometimes with shaking hands, sometimes with fire in my voice, and always with one truth at the center: you are not what they did to you. I used to be afraid of mirrors. Now I look into them and say, there you are. I used to be afraid of silence. Now I treasure it like a sacred hymn. Eleanor is 13 now. Sharp, brave, loud. She questions everything, even God, especially God. One night she asked me, "Why did you still believe in him after all that?" I thought about that for a long time. And I said, because if I didn't, I would have only had fear left. And fear was already taking up too much space in my life. She nodded like she understood more than I expected. I told her everything last year. All of it. We sat on the floor of her bedroom, and I told her about my childhood. The pain, the silence, the man, the house, the fire, the letters, the scars, the way I lost my voice and how I learned to steal it back. She didn't cry. She held my hand and said, "Thank you for protecting me from that world." And I did. I protected her, not perfectly, but fiercely. And in protecting her, I protected the girl I once was. There's a photo in my hallway. Me, Carol, Eleanor, Tommy. We're at the beach. The wind is wild. Our hair's a mess. We're laughing. It's framed in driftwood, and written underneath, I carved these words: we survived. We remember. We rise. Carol passed last spring, peacefully, in her sleep. She left me her journals, her recipes, and a note that read, "You are the story I always hoped would end in freedom." I visit her grave often, bring sunflowers, read her poems out loud, like she's still listening. And sometimes I swear I feel her hand on my shoulder. At church last Sunday, the new pastor asked me if I would speak at the women's retreat. I hesitated, not because I was afraid, but because the version of me who once begged to be invisible still lives inside me, and I have to remind her we're allowed to be seen now. So I said yes, and I stood in that room, in front of 50 women, some with bruises, others with silent eyes, and I told them, the worst thing that ever happened to you is not the end of your story. They cried. So did I. And when I finished, a young woman came up to me and whispered, "You gave me permission to live." That's all I ever wanted. Not justice, not revenge, just life. Real, honest, raw. A life without looking over my shoulder every second. A life where I could breathe deep and know the air wouldn't choke me. A life where love wasn't a trap, but a home. I walk every morning at sunrise. I journal every night before bed. I keep Eleanor's baby stegosaurus on my nightstand, faded and torn, a reminder of what I once feared and what I now hold sacred. Sometimes I hear a voice in my head, the voice of the man who tried to erase me. But now I have another voice, stronger, wiser, my own. And she says, "You made it, Margaret. You made it all the way. And now you get to live." If you've listened to this story until the end, you are part of it. You are proof that truth matters, that stories can heal, that voices can rise from ashes. Please, if this touched you in any way, write in the comments. I believe in healing. Give this video a like. Subscribe to this channel. Not for me, but for every woman still waiting to be seen. Because together, we don't just survive. We rise.